Herzlich willkommen zu Tag 2 von Die Zukunft der Kritik in der Akademie der Künste und der Bundeskunsthalle. Ich darf vorstellen Angela Lammert, Leiterin interdisziplinäre Sonderprojekte an der Akademie der Künste.
Und ich darf vorstellen Kolja Reichert, Leiter des Diskursprogramms an der Bundeskunsthalle Bonn, die wir gemeinsam den Kongress vorbereitet haben.
Hinter uns liegt ein reicher Tag unter dem Titel Kritik in der Hyperzirkulation. Wir haben erfahren, wie prekär die Situation der Kritik geworden ist, ökonomisch, aber auch durch die Bedingungen der Zirkulation von Wissen und von Äußerungen im Plattformkapitalismus. Die Öffentlichkeit wurde verabschiedet und als Hologramm quasi in den Äther geschickt von New Models. Und das ist ein guter Anschluss zum heutigen Tagesthema. Aufstieg und, nein, wir haben es optimistisch andersrum betitelt.
Fall und Aufstieg
der kritischen Öffentlichkeit.
Genau. Was ist Kritik? Diese Fragestellung rührt an das immer neu zu aktualisierende und kritisch zu analysierende Erbe der Aufklärung. Wenn wir gestern Abend also nach kritischen Infrastrukturen gefragt haben, die auf kollektive Formen des Wissens als politische Kraft zielen, Kunst, Bildung, Gesundheitsprojekte und politische Ökonomie miteinander in Beziehung setzen, dann wird es heute von der politischen Theorie und in den Geschichte her um die Verflechtung von Aufklärung, Dekolonisierung und dem Ästhetischen gehen. Nikita Dhawans Titel ist ein schönes Wortspiel, ästhetische Aufklärung und die Kunst der Dekolonisierung. Gemeinsam mit Maria Doma Kostra-Varela hat sie das bekannte Buch Postkoloniale Theorie, eine kritische Einführung, mehrfach aufgelegt, verfasst. Sie hat ihre wissenschaftliche Karriere in Mumbai, Indien begonnen, wo sie Philosophie und German and Gender Studies studierte und ist seit 2021 am Philosophischen Institut der TU Dresden Professorin für Politikwissenschaften. Unvergessen ist mir ihr Auftritt mit Gayatri Spivak und Angela Davis bei dem Symposium in der Akademie der Künste Decolonization Repercussion 2018. Sie ist eine Brückenbauerin. Ihr neues Projekt ist es, die Aufklärung vor den Europäern zu retten. Gerade weil die postkolonialen Studies als Anti-Aufklärung angesehen werden, dass sie mit kolonialer Macht und faschistischem Terror einhergehen, schlägt sie kritische Theorien der Dekolonisierung vor. Lieblingszitat ist von Spivak: We live in a world in which the rapists are in charge of Rabbit Kid. Wir freuen uns auf den Vortrag.
It's a great pleasure for me to kick off today with my talk. I'd like to give my deepest gratitude to the Bundeskunsthalle and the ADK for organizing this event. I think it's an extremely topical issue. And like I said, warm thanks to Angela and Kolja for the invitation. Last year, I was invited to deliver the opening keynote at the Kunstsammlung NRW in Düsseldorf for their initiative, for their exhibition Nichts als Zukunft. There was a special exhibition of the Ghanaian British artist Lynette Yadom Bayoke. The curator shared with me two interesting stories about the exhibition. The first story the curator told me was really encouraging about how the artist, whose parents were immigrants from Ghana and worked as nurses, was receiving incredible accolades. While the paintings were on their way to Düsseldorf, the insurance company called K20 as the value of one of the paintings had gone up dramatically, and so it had to be reevaluated. It was, of course, exciting to hear about the success of a black artist who only paints black people in her paintings doing everyday mundane things. But then came the second story, which was a sobering example of the challenges of decolonizing the arts. The curator was standing in the foyer when she was approached by a black woman, a middle-aged black woman, who told the curator she wanted to see the exhibition but could not afford the €12 ticket. The curator made it possible for the black visitor to see the exhibition, but both these stories indicate the complex relation between art, art institutions, and capitalism. An excellent example of art washing is how during the COVID pandemic, while millions of people lost their livelihood and are driven to precarity, museums like Met are flushed with funds as its super wealthy donors became even richer during the crisis. So I know this because I was cooking one day and was listening to the radio, and there was a very interesting radio interview with the director, Max Hollein, who was asked about the crisis during that art institutions were facing, and he said, well, our situation is different. My final example is the keynote speech delivered by the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie at the ceremony of the opening of the Humboldt Forum on 22nd September 2022. In all the German newspapers and social media reports, I mean, this was before Documenta, there was consensus about how critical Adichie's talk was and how celebrated this talk was, what a good resonance this talk had in the German media. And I merely wondered, what is the price of critique? How much did Adichie charge to remind Germans of their bad faith? So just to share a visual with you all here. While Adorno questions the right to the right of art to exist, also Existenzrecht der Kunst, during the pandemic, the foremost question has been, are the arts an essential service, as vital as health, education, defense? Also, I like the German question, systemrelevant, sind die Kunst, ist die Kunst systemrelevant? To take inspiration from the trade union Verdi, I would argue that certainly arts are system-relevant, without question. But the question is, are they relevant in a false system? Die sind natürlich relevant, aber im falschen System relevant. Art practices, art institutions are deeply entrenched within structures of capitalism and neocolonialism, and thus in trying to resist hegemonic structures, they inadvertently consolidate these structures. Just a quick reminder, the first public museum opened in 1779, the Fridericianum in Kassel, and it was designed in the spirit of the Enlightenment idea of public sphere. Perhaps this is not that well known that the Landgrave Friedrich II sold soldiers to the British to finance this museum. Many of these soldiers were captured against their will and shipped over to North America to fight against the rebellion for independence in the British colonies. So there's been a lot of talk around the Nazi background of the Documenta, and this colonial background is sometimes kind of disregarded. This begs the question whether artistic practices and art institutions can play an emancipatory role in the face of current conditions of global inequality. Or are brute facts such as pie charts and statistics more accurate and efficient means of consciousness raising about global problems of poverty, war, and suffering? Nietzsche, in The Will to Power, remarks, "We have art in order not to die of the truth," which rejects reducing the complexity of our world to what Adorno and Horkheimer would call instrumental reason. In contrast, not in contrast, to supplement Nietzsche's sentiment, I would like to quote Einstein, who says, "Alles, was zählt, kann nicht gezählt werden, und alles, was gezählt werden kann, zählt nicht." In English, everything that can be counted does not necessarily count. Everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. Or, to quote another interesting take on art, the black feminist scholar Bell Hooks remarks, "The function of art is to do more than tell like it is to imagine what is possible." In German, die Aufgabe der Kunst ist mehr als zu erzählen, wie Dinge sind, es ist zu zeigen, wie es sein könnte. I love the German Konjunktiv 2, es sein könnte. This holds the promise that radical and militant aesthetic practices can foster transnational ethics by provoking us out of our indifference and irresponsibility. Instead of being overwhelmed by what is in German called empathy fatigue, in German Empathiemüdigkeit, in English empathy fatigue, witnessing the pain of others mediated through aesthetic practices can perhaps nurture global solidarity. In fact, even neurobiologists argue that helping others can release happiness hormones. So doing good for others is good for our own health. It can be argued then that more than familiarizing us with the unfamiliar, critical aesthetic practices, the radicality of critical aesthetic practices lies in defamiliarizing the familiar. They enable a politics of estrangement, foregrounding the opacity, the non-transparency of the obvious and the given. The promise of radical politics of representation, and again, English is such a poor language, we have only one word. In German, you have both Darstellung and Vertretung, so as to facilitate a post-imperial politics. Can artists be the Trägerschicht, agents of decolonization, who facilitate, nurture anti-racist, anti-imperialist aesthetic practices? Are they the avant-gardes of decolonization? Although these questions sound very promising, I would focus on the very complex, difficult relation between aesthetics, politics, and ethics. Just to give you another example, in her second novel of the trilogy, Parable of the Talents, Octavia Butler has a 15-year-old black kid as a protagonist who suffers from what Butler calls, if you all are into feminist science fiction, please go and have a look at Octavia Butler's novels. So this 15-year-old young black woman suffers from hyper-empathy syndrome, which is the uncontrollable ability to feel the sensations she witnesses in others, particularly the abundant pain in her world. Now, at some point in the novel, she is gang raped and experiences this unique, singular experience of the violation of her body and at the same time, the pleasure of her rapist. This story is a sobering example of romantic proclamations of globalization, of compassion. In fact, Plato was deeply distrustful of art as dangerous, for in his view, it distorts truth and reality and manipulates emotions. So in Plato's Republic, the artists were banished from the ideal community. This brings to mind the historical role of art in fascist and colonial regimes, and Adorno's remark, there can be no poetry after Auschwitz, which alludes to the historic grief and mourning for a disenchanted aesthetics. How could the creators, and this is really a puzzle, how could the creators of such sublime music, art, poetry, and literature commit such horrible crimes against humanity? How could the land of Bach, Goethe, and Kant produce Hitler, Goebbels, and Eichmann? It indicates the failure of the Eurocentric civilizational ideal of Bildung. I'm not talking about Erziehung, I'm not talking about education, I'm talking about the specific German word, Bildung. The promise of art to make the world better and showcase the creative and affirmative aesthetic practices remains controversial. In light of these considerations, we are faced with a conundrum. Should art be committed, useful, and participatory, or autonomous? The wonderful Kantian word, unzweckmäßig, and not be put into service of ethical and political imperatives. Adorno claims that art with a political message is reactionary. More than radical, irrespective of its content, it renders aesthetics a mere function. So Adorno makes to put it in a very shorthand manner, makes a distinction between bad art and good art. And an example of bad art for Adorno is Brecht. The first time I read this as a young student in Mumbai, I almost thought, oh, my German was not right. So according to Adorno, a lack of distance between art and social praxis is anathema, and Adorno famously claimed, rather no art than socialist realism. Brecht's art in Adorno's reading only manages to depict reality superficially, thereby failing in his intentions. It only, this stands, in contrast to, so Brecht for Adorno is bad art, and good art is Beckett. And why is Beckett's art good art? Because it does not resort to didactics in the representation of social suffering. Dismissing Brecht's manipulative technique, which prioritizes doctrine over form, Adorno foregrounds the ambiguity of autonomous art that inspires rather than sermonizes. Political art for Adorno is the instrumentalization of art. Irrespective of the content, art with a political message, in Adorno's view, is reactionary rather than political, for it reduces aesthetics to being a mere tool. Political art tends towards the propagandistic while sacrificing the aesthetic. Gorged against committed art stands autonomous art, which has no obvious use value, but rather dialectical critique is performed through abstraction, absurdity, and parody. In Adorno's reading, autonomous art is self-critical and reflexive. It is self-doubt, self-scrutiny, which is foregrounded, like the works of Beckett, which go beyond merely mirroring empirical reality and documenting history. How do you summarize Waiting for Godot? Two people are waiting and waiting and waiting. Rather than promoting a specific ideology or being socially useful, the commitment of autonomous art lies in providing a counterpoint to existing social norms. Adorno's fears about the politicization of aesthetics, wherein it becomes mere instrument of competing ideologies, seems to be confirmed in this year's Documenta. I'm sure all of y'all in the audience are suffering from Documenta fatigue. So I'll keep the next section short and then move on to my next point. So the next point is called the German art of self-critique. And again, a play on the art. Also die deutsche Kunst der Selbstkritik. In her book, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil, Susan Neiman argues that Germany is exemplary. Again, I like the German word vorbildlich because it has Bild in it. So Germany is exemplary in how a country can come to terms with its historical wrongdoings. The book traces the long and difficult path Germans faced in their effort to atone for the crimes of the Holocaust. Progress is evident in laws, in language, in how diversity is handled, according to Neiman. So to quote Neiman, no other country in the world has come close to facing the crimes of its history as Germany has. End of quote. Neiman's faith in Germany, in German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, seems to be misplaced, and the controversy around the Documenta is a case in point. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz did not visit the Documenta exhibition this year, and allegations of anti-Semitism linked to the contemporary art show, which was dubbed as post-colonialism's Waterloo. A press release announced, and I quote, Olaf Scholz is a big fan of the Documenta and has probably not missed a Documenta in the past 30 years. However, Scholz has decided not to visit this year's edition. End of quote. Artist Hito Steil also pulled her work from the Documenta, saying she has no faith in the organizer's ability to address anti-Semitism. The reputed art critic Beson Brock had the following to comment. I quote, all these states of the global south are not only religious fundamentalist in orientation, but compared to the welfare states of Western Europe, they virtually allow asocial, in original German, asoziale attitudes to be taken for granted. End of quote. It's ironic that Brock uses Nazi vocabulary to describe post-colonial anti-Semitism. During the Documenta controversy, I had to think of Gayatri Spivak's remark, and Angela already mentioned it. We seem to live in a world where the rapists have taken charge of the rape kit. Let me explain what I mean. In 1990, a Bundeswehr ad appeared that featured Picasso's anti-war painting. Underneath, it read, enemy images are the fathers of war. I hope the irony of the Bundeswehr using Picasso's Guernica for marketing purposes to attract recruitments is not lost on this audience. Despite the controversy, the Bundeswehr did not apologize for the campaign. Scholz did not visit the Documenta in June 2020, but went to Saudi Arabia and Qatar in September 2022. Sorry, he did not visit the Documenta in June 2022, but went to Saudi Arabia and Qatar in September 2022 in order to deepen energy partnership with both these countries. In 1947, Saudi Arabia voted against the United Nations partition plan for Palestine, which aimed to split the territory of British Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state. Saudi Arabia has not recognized Israel since the latter's independence in 1948. And Saudi Arabia and Qatar both do not accept Israeli-issued passports. I think they made an exception. Qatar made an exception now for the World Cup football. So if you have an Israeli passport, you can go to Qatar to watch the football matches. Steil was accused of double standards and dishonesty as she received funding from Julia Stoschek, who partly financed Steil's Factory of the Sun at the German pavilion of the Venice Biennale 2015. Stoschek later bought the artwork, which is on display in her private museum. For those who might not be familiar with the Julia Stoschek Foundation, Julia Stoschek is the billionaire heiress to a car parts fortune. Stoschek's great-grandfather, the German industrialist Max Brose, was a member of the Nazi Party. The link between the Stoschek family's fortune and forced labor in World War II has been well known. Julia Stoschek collection is one of the world's preeminent private institutions for media art. Stoschek claimed that no artist from her collection has voiced concerns to her about her family history. In her words, they trust us. I take this quote from a New York Times article. Steil accuses postcolonial studies of ignoring the German context in her text, Kontext ist König außer der Deutsche, and of not adequately engaging with anti-Semitism while at the same time Steil at the same time received funding from the Stoschek Foundation with its dubious past. When I read this, I had to think about Hannah Arendt's words, the problem was not what our enemies did, but what our friends did. End of quote. Unlike Steil, I'm not a German citizen. And coming from the global south, persons like me are automatically guilty, until proven innocent, of being ignorant of the German context. Our right to participate in the German public sphere must be proven through our Integrationswilligkeit and our Integrationsfähigkeit. We from the postcolonial world have to prove that we have the requisite qualifications to exercise critique, a birthright you automatically acquire with the German citizenship. The asymmetrical ignorance here is mind-boggling, because artists like Steil can be players in the global art market without ever having lived for a considerable period of time in the global south or learning any of its languages. And yet, this does not disqualify their critical interventions on global issues. For instance, my commitment to fighting anti-Semitism, not only in Germany but globally, does not rest on some misguided or misplaced sense of German identity politics. I did not have to come to Germany to learn about genocidal anti-Semitism from persons with Nazi background. Growing up in India, I had Jewish neighbors, and as a student at Humboldt-Universität, was deeply influenced by the Indian Jewish poet Nissim Ezekiel, a foundational figure in post-colonial India's literary history and father of modern Indian English poetry. Ezekiel belonged to Mumbai's Marathi-speaking Jewish community known as the Ben Israel, and in his writings addressed the experiences of anti-Semitism as an Indian Jew. But at the same time, while most Ben Israel moved to Israel, Ezekiel actively decided to keep India as his homeland. To quote one of his poems, this line is from his poem called The Room, "The door is always open, but I cannot leave." End of quote. I give these examples because a common remark since the Documenta controversy has erupted is, and this is a remark I hear everywhere I go, is, as a German citizen, it is my special responsibility to condemn anti-Semitism. I strongly reject this form of provinciality and draw attention to the astute analysis of the German-Israeli philosopher Omri Böhm, who chastises Jürgen Habermas for his politics. In an interview in 2012, Habermas stated, and I quote, "The present situation and the politics of the Israeli government do require a political kind of evaluation, but this is not the business of a private German citizen of my generation," end of quote. As Böhm compellingly argues, the critical engagement with the Holocaust should contribute to global solidarity and strengthening of universal norms of human rights and international law, instead of feeding ethno-nationalistic projects which exclude other forms of memorialization. Böhm warns that when the master, and here he's talking about Habermas, of discourse ethics and public intellectual par excellence avoids public exercise of one's reason, Kant told us, Enlightenment ist Ausgang aus der selbstverschuldeten Unmündigkeit, for English speakers, exit from self-incurred tutelage. And when Habermas refuses to take a stance, he is betraying Enlightenment critical tradition of having the courage to think for oneself, which is why I say we need to rescue the Enlightenment from the Europeans. This has far-reaching consequences that goes beyond self-censorship, as it indicates the ultimate test of Enlightenment thinking itself. In face of withdrawal of critical judgment and deliberation in the public sphere. It is not a coincidence that Habermas has been silent. It's not a coincidence because Habermas has also been silent on colonialism and its consequences for critical theory. And I quote from an interview, when he was asked if his theory was relevant for the third world, Habermas responded, and I quote him, "I'm tempted to say no. I'm aware of the fact that this is Eurocentrically limited view. I would rather pass the question," end of quote. It's been argued that the problems that cannot be solved in politics are now being deflected to the aesthetic and the cultural sphere. So, foreign policy somehow, the problems that arise in foreign policy are now pushed on to the cultural and aesthetic sphere, and Documenta is a case in point. So that Scholz can easily travel to Saudi Arabia and Qatar to pursue energy deals, while in the German feuilletons, artists like Steil discredit post-colonial studies and the global south for disregarding the German context. I would counter-argue with Antonio Gramsci that there is an important link between foreign policy and the aesthetic sphere, for this is precisely how cultural hegemony is produced. What an important role organic intellectuals play in the production of hegemony. It's not brute force and coercion, but the non-state apparatus and organic intellectuals, like artists and cultural workers, who consolidate state ideology. This is not to pit, and just to make a point, just to, politics of location, we are here at the Bundeskunsthalle here. It's a very, very important part of German soft power. We should not forget that. This is now not to pit minorities in Europe against the global south, but unfortunately, the Documenta is a bitter example of the uneasy alliance between the diaspora and the post-colonial world. Europe and Europeans deploy self-critique as a weapon to humiliate and discredit non-European critical thought. Europe claims that its tradition of self-critique and self-evaluation enables Europeans to reflect upon their crimes and failures so as to self-correctively emerge as more ethical and responsible. This special critical tradition is repeatedly celebrated in all grand discourses on Europe by Europeans. Europe's practice of questioning itself, self-scrutiny, self-doubt, is considered the greatest strength and the most significant legacy of European Enlightenment. This supposedly sets it apart from other cultures who are deemed incapable of self-reflection. The imperative of relating to oneself in a critical fashion and the ensuing self-improvement is in both thought and action is proclaimed to be singularly and uniquely European. But as the psychoanalyst and literary scholar Adam Phillips points out, self-critique can be an unforbidden pleasure. So there are pleasures that are forbidden, and then there are unforbidden pleasures. Because He says self-critique is unimaginative and narcissistic. You're only engaging with yourself. Europe bewitches us with its claim of being able to be self-reflective through self-reproach. In my view, European self-critique is non-performative. And here I take the term from Sarah Emmert, who points out that non-performativity of an utterance does not indicate its failure. Rather, its very success lies in not doing what it claims, even as it is read as performative, namely, as doing what it pledges. The farce of European claims of self-improvement through the practice of self-critique is that there is a negative relation between rhetoric and reality. For all the talk about European commitments to anti-discrimination, equality, freedom, democracy, justice, human rights, critical rhetoric does not deliver a post-imperial politics and ethics. Just to give you again a concrete example, because I went into theory in the last 10-15 minutes, the murder of climate activists in countries like Colombia, Brazil, and the Philippines in recent years has been unprecedented. And yet, when we think about the current ecological movement, we think of the first world activists of Fridays for Future. So this is from the World Economic Forum in January 2020 Davos, and this is the image that was circulated all around the world. The original image actually looked like this. And they just simply cropped out the Ugandan activist Vanessa Nakate from the photo. So this is the image that was circulated all around the world. I hope you get my point. In her book, An Aesthetic Education, Gayatri Spivak speaks of transnational literacy and planetary ethics. So we're not talking about intercultural competence. We're not talking about the Integrationsfähigkeit and Willigkeit of migrants in the German context. We're talking about transnational literacy and planetary ethics. This moves beyond Western liberal notions of cosmopolitanism and digital humanities. Warning against dangers of performative gestures of inclusion, Spivak pleads for a redistribution of agency and a new international division of intellectual labor. Decentering Eurocentrism necessitates training the imagination to approach difference in a non-paternalistic manner. And here, art functions as pharmacon. It can be both poison, but also medicine, counterpoison. The tragedy that is playing out in Germany at the moment is that there is no scope, and this is a term I take from Jacques Derrida, critical intimacy between diverse aesthetic practices in the current political climate. Any efforts to think together human suffering and pain in its various manifestations is rendered taboo. So my argument is you don't decolonize the space here by inviting Nikita Dhawan to give the keynote. I'm part of the transnational elite. We need a much, much more nuanced approach to the question of how we need to transform spaces, how we need to rethink the very question of the role of art. So my final example. In his play, Dak Ghar, written in Bengali by the Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore in 1911, so my final example is the play Dak Ghar, or the story around the play Dak Ghar, in English Post Office. This play was translated into French by André Gide and was read on the radio the night before Paris fell to the Nazis. During World War II, there were 105 performances of Dak Ghar in concentration camps in Germany. Perhaps one of the most noteworthy was its staging by Janusz Kocek, the pen name of Henry Goldsmith, a Polish Jewish educator who ran a Jewish orphanage in the ghetto in Warsaw. It was there that the play was organized for children just a few weeks before they, as well as Kocek, was deported to the concentration camps of Treblinka. So this is the invitation that was sent by Kocek announcing that Dak Ghar would be performed by the orphans in the Warsaw Ghetto. The story of Dagkar, the post office, revolves around a young child named Amal, an orphan who suffers from an ailment and is homebound. In his quest to explore the world beyond the confines of his home, he sits near a window facing a road and talks to people passing by. Amal is fascinated by the newly constructed post office near his window and imagines receiving letters from the king. The play represents a vivid picture of Amal, his longings, his ideas of life, and the limitations he faces in the face of his own mortality. Kozak's children's home in the Warsaw Ghetto held nearly 200 children between the ages of 7 and 14. Food rations were difficult to acquire, and hunger, starvation, and illness were ever present, as was the threat of mass deportations. Now, in this time of fear and suffering, one could ask, why did Koszek have his orphans stage a play? And even if he wanted to stage a play, why take one by an Indian playwright from a faraway country? In the bleakness of the Warsaw Ghetto, Kozak helped children prepare their costumes out of materials like old bed sheets and torn socks. It's reported that the children were excited by the prospect of an entire community coming to see them perform. Kozak, in his diary after the performance of the post office, so the performance happened, and 3 days later they were deported to Treblinka, and this was one of the last entries in his diary, and I quote from there. He says, "What would have happened if the actors of yesterday were to continue in their roles today? Yeshek fancied himself a fakir, Chaimek, a real doctor, Adek, the Lord Mayor." End of quote. 3 days later, mass deportations to Treblinka began, and neither Koszek nor his children would be spared. In performing the tragic play about a young ailing boy in India on the verge of an untimely death, the most obvious explanation would be that Koszek was perhaps preparing the orphans in his care in Warsaw for their eventual death. But a more compelling reasoning is that it was an effort to give these children dignity through aesthetics when they had been robbed of their humanity. Taking inspiration from Jewish ethics, it is my firm belief that in the interest of repairing the world, tikkun olam, we need another politics of critique and self-critique. Let me end with the metaphor of the 7 blind men and the elephant. And again, this is when the Documenta controversy was happening. I wrote my PhD on this. So I had to think about the 7 blind men and the elephant. And those of you all who are not familiar with this story, each blind man claims that his perspective is the only valid one and dismisses those of others as false. The claim to a universal and uniform truth leads to the negation and exclusion of every other point of view. Now, in classical Aristotelian logic, which has deeply influenced Western thought and European Enlightenment, there can be only 2 possibilities, namely true or false, and these are mutually exclusive. And this 2-valued order of thought has a very, very strict limitation. In contrast to Aristotelian binary logic, and this is where the story comes from, there is a theory in heterodox Jain school, this is pre-colonial ancient Indian philosophical tradition, which is called Anekantavada in Sanskrit, and it's very closely linked to the practice of ahimsa, which, to translate both the terms into English from Sanskrit, Anekantavada can be translated into non-one-sidedness, and ahimsa can be translated into English as non-violence. Now, according to the Jain theory of non-absolutism or non-one-sidedness, our insights are always partial and never exhaustive. Thus, each of the blind men was partially right, but all were also partially wrong. Instead of one-upmanship or neoliberal claim to free speech, so to end with my understanding of critique, we need to go beyond this idea that my Kant, Marx, Foucault, Derrida, Butler is longer than your Kant, Foucault, Butler, Derrida. And that instead of this one-upmanship or a neoliberal, liberal or neoliberal claim to free speech, we need to recognize the limitations of our own perspectives. And this would safeguard against silencing or excluding of dissenting positions, and to exercise, I mean, it's impossible and yet necessary, exercise a kind of non-exclusionary, non-violent politics of speech. As long as we are able to acknowledge that we might not be right, it might help us from being self-righteous. And then there is the possibility of demonopolization of critique through intellectual modesty and hopefully another politics and ethics of listening. Thank you very much for your attention. And I can see that we have another 15 minutes to go. So I would be very happy to take a couple of questions from the audience. I've been told there are 2 mics here, which the audience members can use to pose your questions. Thank you once again for your attention.
Hope are plenty. I first want to thank, in the name of Angela, also for this talk, which was a real Nikita Dhawan, in the sense of using highest theoretical abstraction with a mix with most concrete examples in historical context to actually expand the space that allows us to even focus on the same subjects. The public sphere is back. Thank you, Nikita. I just want to quickly also expand the perspective on one crucial detail that you used, which is the example of Hito Steyerl. And as Hito Steyerl is a member of the Akademie der Künste and also will talk on the last panel of this conference on the 26th, I just wanted to hint to the fact that Hito Steyerl has spent a lot of time in the global south, if you count the Kurdish communities or societies in Iraq and Syria and Turkey as part of the global south. And I think, as I understand her article, she did not, in general, judge post-colonial theory for a blindness on a German context, but rather called for responsibility when this theory is applied in Germany, in German institutions. Concerning the work that was brought by Julia Stoschek, as I understood, due to a lack of public funding, the only possibility to finish the German pavilion in the Venice Biennial in 2015 was actually to sell Factory Sun to Julia Stoschek. And under the impression of ongoings this summer, Hito Steyerl decided to buy the work back. And both like withdrawing from Documenta and buying the work back are, of course, measures to insist on the necessity on dealing with German responsibilities. And as a half Japanese growing up in Bavaria, Hito Steyerl really knows what it means to face racism in Germany.
Thank you for her defense. It's interesting to hear these things, but I won't go into details because I don't want the discussion only to be about her. I just took her as a case in point. You mentioned her Japanese background, and it would have been, in that sense also, I think, a kind of perhaps ethical move to talk about also then Japanese occupation of Indonesia in all her in her comments or her interventions during the Documenta. So that's also, I think one of the most important things that we've learned from Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak is not what is said, but what is left silent.
Thank you. Hinter Ihnen finden Sie ein Mikrofon. Ich glaube, genau. Danach war Gina Carrière und dann Marie Ines.
Yeah, I would like to support what you have been saying. From my research in a completely different area, economics, I learned that results that I got in Germany did not apply in China, for instance. And what I learned by this, by my research, is that we have to be aware exactly what you have been saying, that truth in our culture does not mean that the same applies in cultures in other cultures. And this, I think, is something, as you said, which is really, really important to have in mind, that you don't have a single truth. And when I presented these results at an international conference, I was asked by a researcher from a Western country saying, well, don't you think that people did not understand what you have been, it was an experiment, what they have been doing. And that was one thing, and since it was a video experiment, I knew that they understood. And then somebody from Japan came and said, this is exactly how we are thinking in our culture. And I think this was for me so important to see, to have this self-critique, or at least admit that truth is not a single, is not single in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's a huge debate in political theory, in philosophy, but also in other disciplines about, you know, what do we do with universal norms like human rights, justice, democracy, if we kind of start questioning the universal validity of these norms. The danger is that you fall into some kind of cultural relativism. This is also, for example, Habermas's critique of Adorno's and Horkheimer's dialectics of enlightenment. The accusation is that there will be a form of normative nihilism if you kind of fall into what Habermas calls the trap of, cultural relativism of plurality. And my counter-argument to this is that we need to circumvent this juxtapositioning of universalism on the one hand and particularism on the other hand by being very sensitive to the historical and linguistic context in which these concepts emerged. The colleague earlier, just pointed out that somebody, the person we were talking about, has also lived in the Global South. Now, my counter-argument here is that what is mostly happening, whether we're talking about aid workers or we're talking about cultural workers or artists or intellectuals, we're constantly parachuting from one context to the other. So wherever we are conflict junkies, we're in Iran today and we are tomorrow in Brazil, and this also has partly to do with the digitalization of the public sphere. And I think one kind of antidote to this kind of, very banal juxtapositioning of universalism versus cultural relativism is learning other kinds of languages, non-European languages. Anybody who's ever learned another language knows what a painstaking process it is to learn other words. Yeah? I mean, and that would be my response to this critique or this anxiety of what do we do with the universal validity of norms of human rights, justice, democracy, because the moment you learn another language, you take yourself the trouble to learn also concepts in other languages and what that means. I am very, very careful not to present Indian philosophical concepts in these kinds of audiences, because the audiences, halfway to nirvana when I use a Sanskrit term. Yeah, they all get into an esoteric sphere when you talk about ahimsa and anekantavada. And the problem is, how do you present non-European concepts without them being orientalized, without exoticizing? I mean, if I stood here in a salwar kameez with a bindi and talked about ahimsa, all of y'all would get a spiritual orgasm here. So, you know, when people tell me, oh, this person knows the context, this person was here and this person was there, learn the language. See what it does to you. How long it takes to learn another language, to get into, and this is not my original argument. It's a very, very strong argument made by people who are talking about transnational ethics. You want to show solidarity with women who are protesting in Iran? Learn Farsi. Don't click on Twitter and say like. Spend the next 20 years in communicating with people there. Learn what their anxieties are, what their aspirations are, what their utopias are. And then we'll talk about transnational ethics. Sorry, I didn't mean to get... I feel very strongly about this because the problem that I think we are facing right now, and I know Heidegger is a deeply, deeply problematic thinker to quote in this context, is there's a lot of Gerede. The problem is that speech and words and categories have been completely, they've been purged of their efficaciousness. We throw words around when we use words like solidarity and talk about alliance building. And I think that sometimes we need to practice not only another ethics of listening, but another politics of also silence, so that the words may once again be reclaimed. But I wanted to give the audience a chance to pose more questions and not give you another talk.
Hello, my name is Maria Inés Plaza. Thank you so much for your brilliant intervention today. I have a question that it's very hard for me to formulate, so I'll try my best since as an editor of a multi-language, polyglot newspaper called Arts of the Working Class, I saw myself this week with a woman, Saye Azarpana, who was infuriated about the edits that we did in English because the translations from voice messages in Farsi and text paragraphs in Persian, like the slight differences, were translated in a way that it was already containing certain biases that wouldn't allow to transmit not only the anger, but the anger well argumented against certain kind of cultural actors living in New York, pretending to silence their role also in supporting the Iranian Revolution. But we're caught here in the having a conversation in English and German language, and we are listening to, let's say, standard candles in thinking, also specifically Western thinking. As you said, you are limiting the references for us. But I'm wondering what you mean also in this Aristotelian binary logic as impossibility and necessity of understanding that there is something more beyond the neoliberal claim of free speech. What is that impossibility and what is that necessity exactly? And if we can try to maybe use as an example the state of art criticism today, how would you place that binary logic and how would you suggest to exit it? Thank you.
Thank you. You've raised a lot of very, very important issues, and the countdown in front of me says that I only have 3 minutes left. I'm just showing you my Integrationsfähigkeit and Willigkeit about timekeeping here. I don't know which of the questions to answer because you raised so many important points. Maybe I might just limit myself to the question of this point you made about, neoliberal and liberal approach to free speech and censorship. Again, to come back to what has been happening in Germany in the last few months, it's interesting to note that very unfortunate, my fellow Mumbaiite Salman Rushdie, when he was attacked, it was quite striking how the Western media reported the attacks on Salman Rushdie. And once again, this whole liberal discourse on free speech and freedom of thinking and free thinking and what a deplorable act it was to attack Rushdie. And suddenly Rushdie became an embodiment of all the liberal values. And I had to think, what a incredible hegemonic listening is playing out in the European context, because of course the target of Rushdie's critique is mostly Islam. And how there is a certain, erotics of listening also, because the Zielgruppe, the group that Rushdie is critiquing is that Europe has a lot of, pleasure, takes a lot of pleasure in proclaiming, on the one hand, being protectors and promoters of free speech, and at the same time, I don't need to, again, go into detail about what is happening in Germany, in France, in Europe right now, in the name of also hate speech, and in the name of what kinds of hate speech, what acts of hate speech are being regulated and what are not being regulated. Look at the discussions around Twitter, and how when Elon Musk is the one who promises that he's the biggest promoter and protector of free speech, one already questions liberal commitments to free speech. And again, because the whole panel is supposed to be about counter-public spheres, public spheres and counter-public spheres, what is very conveniently erased in the whole discussion around speech and free speech is the material context in which our speech acts are made possible. So to go back to a historical analysis, when Kant talks about and describes, the emergence, the birth of European Enlightenment, and talks about coffee houses and reading rooms where reason went public, Ausgang aus der selbstverschuldeten Unmündigkeit, and Habermas, drawing on Kant, talks about public spheres. My question is, where did the coffee come from that the bourgeois men were drinking? Where did the tobacco come from? Where did the sugar in the coffee come from? Who financed the Enlightenment? Yeah? To quote Fanon, Europe is literally a product of its colonies. And the same thing is playing out today when we are tweeting our support, whether it's for Iranian protesters or whichever protest movement is flavor of the day, and what is it's always agency and complicity. I am equally complicit in these global structures. When we use our gadgets to tweet anti-imperialism slogans, one sees how the erotics of resistance is playing out. My watch tells me that we are all out of time. And thank you once again for the invitation. Thank you once again for the questions. And I look forward to the other contributions and wish all of us a wonderful day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikita Dhawan, our most humble expression of thanks for pulling the ground away below our feet and expanding the space of speech.